This week in CyberSchool, we're going to be going over the CyberData SIP paging server with Bell Scheduler. Come on, go. So what does the SIP paging server do? The SIP paging server at a base is an analog paging system interface, but it's also commonly referred to as a SIP2 multicast out style device, because this device, when it receives a SIP call, can convert it into multicast, but it can also convert it into an analog signal that can go through a standard analog amplifier, utilizing either the 600 ohm balanced output or the 10,000 ohm unbalanced output. So it gives a lot of flexibility to connect to different analog amplifiers. But the paging server also has a Bell scheduler built into it that supports up to 250 unique Bell events and 25 different Bell files. And with all that, it also supports stored message playback with an additional 25 stored messages. The paging server really can become the head unit of a paging system with all that capability. It's really an analog paging system interface that's just packed full of features. One of the major reasons that you'll want to use the paging server is because it gives a lot of flexibility for zoned paging when you're dealing with IP paging. Because of that 100 paging groups, or P groups, as they're shown in the web interface of the device. Other features like the stored message capability gives it a lot of flexibility to play different stored messages or pre-recorded audio messages that need to be played but don't need to be played at a regular interval, say at 12 o'clock noon every single day. Something that needs to be played on some kind of an interval, but it's not really time-based. Scheduled events are better for those types of messages, where messages that you need to play at a particular given time on a regular basis, say 3 or 4 days a week or every single day. You know, very useful in stores if you need to announce different specials that are going on, or if there's a group huddle or anything that happens at a given time during the day. The scheduled events are extremely powerful for that. And as well as the 2 different audio outputs make the paging server capable of connecting to just about any analog amplifier that's out there in the world. With the what's known as a TEL-based output, which is our 600 ohm tip and ring connection, and the RCA 10,000 ohm connection, you can really connect to just about any amplifier out there that doesn't specifically require a standard telephone connection or a POTS connection. So where would you use the paging server? The paging server is really flexible for things like schools, factories, retail stores, or office buildings because of the additional features like the stored message playback and the scheduled event features. It's also really good for places that need to be able to do complex zoning. Because of the 100 different page groups that the paging server is capable of, it can really handle just about any task. I've never spoken with a customer that actually needs more than 100 zones. I'm sure there's probably people out there that think they do, but I don't think it's realistic, and I think 100 zones is more than anybody would ever actually need. It's really useful for businesses that need to take advantage of emergency notifications, but might not have the funds to go out and purchase a fancy software like Single Wire's Informacast that's really capable and specially designed for doing emergency notifications. We come right there in the middle and provide a lot of flexibility for emergency notifications, all built into a single piece of hardware. Especially with features like the stored message capability, it makes it really easy to send an emergency message with just a few button presses. So for connections on the paging server, of course, we've got the RCA line in for background music. That's pretty common on all of our paging interface devices. So these are great to connect to your standard, just regular radio that's off the shelf, or maybe a Muzak adapter, or other devices that can just play different background music that you could use in a store or facility, or even a radio system at a school. It's very, very powerful. The RCA lineouts used for more modern amplifiers, things that'll actually support an RCA connection. Typically stuff that's produced in the mid-2000s and beyond usually has an RCA interface, and we might be able to connect to that. If not, we've got our tip and ring connections, which are specifically pins 3 and 4 on our green screw down terminal there that's kind of labeled interface. And that's pretty good for connecting to just about any older amplifiers. Those typically use those tip and ring connections. Again, 600 ohm connection. But that's even featured in modern amplifiers that you can buy off the shelf today. Say, for example, like the Bogan TPU series, use that tip and ring connection. It's very reliable. It's good, easy tech. There's a reason that that kind of stuff hasn't been phased out. The paging server also has an onboard relay connection to trigger different actions on an amplifier. Typically, when you're dealing with an amplifier that has multiple different inputs, say one for background music, one for a standard microphone, and then one for, say, a paging system like ours is, it needs some kind of a relay contact closure, or the actual amplifier will have a Vox circuit on it to be able to detect that there's audio on a given input, but most of them use the relay contact closure. So with a feature like enable relay on local audio that the paging server has, when a SIP call is received by the paging server and it transmits that audio through its output connections, it also triggers the onboard relay. And that onboard relay tells the amplifier that we're connected to that a higher priority audio is coming through, and it should silence all of the other audio. So it's very, very powerful for that one particular feature. And then the other feature, the sense input, which are pins 1 and 2, again, they're on that page port interface, are very useful and can be triggered by other systems. So one key example of that is connecting to a fire panel. And we'll get to that connection in a moment. But to just quickly go over the pins and everything on here, because there are different connections on here, and it's always good to specifically mention all the different pin connections. From left to right, of course, we've got pins 1 and 2, which are our fault sense inputs. 3, 4, and 5 are going to be your tip and ring connections. 3 specifically being your positive 600 ohm output, 4 being your negative 600 ohm output, and then 5 being your audio ground. Typically, pins 3, 4, and 5 are used together. Sometimes it's just pins 3 and 4. It really depends on the amplifier that we're connecting to. And then finally, we've got pins 6 and 7, which are our relay contact closure points. The paging amplifier also has, or excuse me, the paging server also has the external power connection on the right-hand side. If PoE is not available in the location, it can also be powered by a 48-volt DC barrel power connector. Typically, we recommend the Cisco Cube power adapter. That does work, but one is not provided directly with the paging server when purchased, because the majority of the customers will use the standard PoE. Since you're going to have to supply a network connection to it, you might as well also supply power through that network connection. So before we get into too much depth about some of the other features of the paging server, let's first go over multicast. So multicast is a way to communicate with multiple devices simultaneously. Unlike a broadcast, which would be another typical way of getting information across a network, a broadcast requires every single device to receive that particular audio stream or just stream across the network. It's a very standard network protocol, and if a broadcast goes out, everything that's on that same network receives it. Multicast is kind of like that, but devices can opt into receiving it. Multicast specifically only occurs on the LAN or local area network, or a VLAN, a virtual local area network. And all the traffic is confined to that particular network segment, so it can really reduce the amount of traffic on a given network. For example, and the way that I like to explain it to tech support is a network can be configured horizontally where all of the equipment is on the exact same plane and everybody's talking on the same network. So if multicast is going out, devices that aren't supposed to be receiving that multicast, just like your regular desktop computer, are still going to be being bombarded with that traffic, and that network traffic and congestion can slow down regular things going on in the network. So typically, VoIP calls and just general telecom calls are segmented onto their own particular network. So things like multicast and other broadcasts don't slow down the available traffic or bandwidth for all the other hardware on the network. But multicast is pretty much supported in a lot of telecom equipment today. Brands like Yealink, Grandstream, Snom, and Poly support it, as well as many others. So it's really widely supported out there, and the paging server can communicate with all of those different brands pretty much off the shelf. There's really no additional configuration that needs to be made besides just tuning those devices into the particular multicast stream. So let's get into paging groups. So the paging groups are the way, again, that the paging server can actually provide that functionality and that zoning paging capability through what we call the P groups page on the actual web interface of the paging server. These are all, you can call them paging groups and think about them as different physical zones, but in reality, they're different multicast groups. As you can tell with the second column from the left there that's labeled address, that's going to be the multicast address that the paging server will actually transmit on. Remember that that's going to be segmented and restricted to that particular LAN or VLAN that the paging server is connected to. They'll also use the port connection that's on there. Specifically, the address and port for the multicast group are required for all of the receiving devices to have input. They all have to be basically tuned into that address and port, much like in your car radio, you turn into a specific radio address. It's just the same for a paging group. Now, all of these groups, again, are IP paging zones. So they won't be necessarily received by a standard analog device, but they can be picked up by your IP paging devices. So things like IP paging speakers, loud horns for your warehouse, or even our SIP paging adapter can receive these different paging groups and could be considered IP paging devices. Now, any of these groups can be either what's known as a live page, where one of these groups, when paged, you can just talk out of it, and whatever you say will be live coming out of all the devices that are actually receiving that audio. Or it can be a stored message group. So when that particular group is triggered, it can go and play the stored message group that's associated with this particular page group. So it makes it really easy to send those emergency notifications, or say that morning huddle notification to get all the people in the retail store together to talk about the deals for the day or any major objectives that they have. That's one of the things that the stored message group capability can do. Now, to go and create a paging group, you just have to click the edit button next to one of the different groups that are listed here. For example, if you clicked the edit button next to paging group number 5 there, you would get this pop-up that we have in the subsequent slide. So in this configure P group pop-up, you get to set the address, port, name, security code, TTL, or time to live. You can check the box for the actual line out capabilities. So the paging server can transmit through its line out connections or cannot, depending on your choice. You can do both simultaneously or not, or you can simply check the play stored message checkbox and then select the desired audio file to play to convert it into that stored message paging group. So the time to live feature is how many hops the multicast can actually go through on the network. So every time that multicast goes through a switch or another device that's simply just passing along the traffic, that counts as one time to live hop and will reduce the number by 1. It's not very common for customers to actually adjust the time to live, as 255 is pretty standard, and it'd be a very complex network if the traffic is going to be going through more than 200 hops. So it's typically fine to leave it at that one default value. We recommend that most customers just leave the address and port combination as standard on the paging server. However, it's very easy to change. The one feature that we do always recommend to change is the actual name of the page group. That way it makes it a lot easier for someone to understand if they need to go in there and actually adjust the paging group, or somebody takes over the actual setup of the device. Makes it a lot easier to understand what a particular page group does because there's a name for it. For example, in the previous slide, you can see that we've got the groups named as such. The first group is an all page group. The second group is a factory only group. The third group is the office area. So if you give definitive names and names that are easy to understand by humans, it makes troubleshooting in the future a lot easier to understand what that particular group is supposed to do. Next, we get into scheduled events, which is again one of the major features of the paging server. Now again, as I mentioned, the paging server can store up to 250 unique events. They can store up to 25 different bell files, and it allows these different bell files to be played, and they can be played on any day of the week. I'm actually using the wrong image here. That's not good. So to create a scheduled event, you'll click the Add button on the scheduled event page, and you'll get this nice little pop-up that I have pictured over here on the right-hand side. And the steps that you'll go through to actually create the scheduled event are to check the different boxes for the days of the week that you want the particular scheduled event to play, and set the time. The time is required to be set in 24-hour format, so that way you don't have to fuss with AM or PM. 24-hour format makes it very, very simple to set the given time in there. After setting the days of the week to play and the time, you'll need to pick an audio file. And the audio file will, of course, need to be uploaded to the audio files page of the paging server before it can actually be selected. So if there is no audio file available in there, you won't be able to create the paging group. After selecting the audio file, you'll have to pick the number of times for that audio file to play. So that's a good way, for example, if you've got an audio file that's just a single beep, to have it play multiple times, so it say beeps 3 times or beeps 4 times. It's a very easy way to go and string a smaller audio file into a longer bell for that more unique sound profile. After picking your audio file and how many times it should play, then you need to set the particular page group that the scheduled event will play to. And that'll correspond to what IP zone that you want it to go to. For it, corresponding with the example that we have before, using group 00, that'll play to the entire factory. Then finally, you'll want to set a name. And again, you just want to set the name so it's easier to understand for everybody as they're going through and setting up the paging server in the future. They'll understand that, oh, this bell going off at this given time is, say, the opening bell for the first day for the day of school, or it's the end of first period, or it's the end of the first morning shift and it's the start of the second shift. There's a lot of capability there, and just naming these particular scheduled events are extremely powerful and extremely helpful. Now, the final option that you have to set here is should the relay activate. Now, the relay activation feature of the scheduled events is a very niche issue, or a very niche feature, and it's very, very powerful in certain instances. When a scheduled event goes off, the relay can either activate for the duration of the bell, so it will activate and stay activated while that particular bell is playing, or activate indefinitely or deactivate indefinitely. So you can, with one bell, trigger the relay and the relay will stay closed, and then with the second bell, open the relay. And there's some given special use cases on why you would want to do that. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about the audio files that the paging server needs to use. So again, like I was mentioning, you have to actually upload an audio file to the paging server so that way you can actually create a bell. And this is done on the audio files tab of the web interface. Now, these two different sections, bells and stored messages, are at the bottom of the audio files page. There's a lot of other audio files that can be adjusted on the paging server, and those are mainly to change the language of the particular message that would be played. So things like your IP address is, and then the device will actually use numbered audio files, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., to actually string together that particular IP address. However, since our devices are sold throughout the world, they might want to use something besides regular English language numbers. So they might change it to the particular language of that locale. And CyberData gives that capability with the standard audio file messages that they could change. But for today's discussion, we're going to specifically talk about the bells and stored messages that are stored down at the bottom of that particular page. And the paging server supports 25 bell files and 25 stored message files for a total of 50, although bell files cannot be triggered as a stored message, nor can stored message audio files be played as a bell. So you can only have 25 bells and 25 stored messages. Now, for the audio file format, our devices do take a particular style of audio file that are required. They have to be RIFF, Little Indian Data, They have to be the wave audio format, Microsoft PCM, 16-bit, mono at 8,000 hertz. And hertz is just the speed that the audio file plays at. There's a lot of different free websites that are available to actually change the audio file for you. Really easy ways to do it, where you just select the particular options that you need and click convert, and it automatically converts the audio file for you. You can also use free tools like Audacity to change the format of the audio file. Those can be a little difficult to work with. So if you're having any trouble actually converting an audio file to the correct format, reach out to our support department. We can do that for you absolutely free with no trouble. So for stored message playback, to actually go and set up stored messages, what you'll want to do, as we were discussing earlier, is just check the box to play stored message. And once you do that, you can select a particular audio file from the stored message section that you uploaded earlier and pick the number of times to play, much like when you're creating a scheduled event. So these are great ways to trigger pre-recorded messages that you would need to play a couple times a day, but not at a particular given time. So things like, say, a blue light special, if you were actually going to a Kmart, or it's most useful for emergency notification, or even, say, a pledge of allegiance at a school. Say if they don't get the morning announcement started at the same time every day, and they do the Pledge of Allegiance during the morning announcements, or just prior to the morning announcements. It's a really easy way to trigger it, where you just call the paging server, select a particular page group, and hang up, and the audio file will play. Very easy way to automate that entire process. So for an example of how to use all the page groups, because you've got these 100 different page groups, I created a nice little demonstration here. So we can see here in our first 5 groups, we've got the all page group, factory only, office area, outside lunch area, or the parking lot in groups 00 through 04. As you can tell there in the leftmost column, they're only shown with a single digit, although the paging server does require 2 digits to be entered. So for those first 10 groups, 0 through 9, you would have to dial 00, 01, etc. As you move forward. And all of these first 5 groups are going to be what we referred to as live page groups, where if you call the paging server and dial group 00 for the all page group, as soon as you talk, whatever you're going to say is going to be live out of those given speakers. However, I would recommend those speakers are all set to buffered audio, so that way you don't get feedback from the speaker overhead, but that's a different subject. For the other groups, we can see that groups 5 through 9 are labeled not in use. You don't have to change the name for those, but I did just for this illustration purpose, as it makes it a lot easier to understand that we're not using those given groups. And for stored message playback, I recommend using groups 10 through 19. Basically reserving groups 1 through 9 for your standard live audio group, so it's really easy to understand and train the users of the paging system. That groups 0 through 9 will give that live audio. If they need to make an announcement, they can use groups 0 through 9, where groups 10 through 19 and beyond are utilized for stored message capability. And that separation and distinct order of how those groups are arranged make it much easier in stressful situations for people to trigger the correct message if necessary. So for example, with group 10, we've got group 10 set to a fire emergency group that's set to an all page. So if somebody calls the paging server and triggers group 10, it'll play a fire emergency message to the all page group. And it's all labeled as such, so it makes it really easy to understand. For groups 11 and 12, those are for emergency gas ventilation, because in this theoretical factory, they produce different chemicals, and they need to vent that gas on different areas of their locale. And that was actually a customer that it's kind of loosely based off a customer that I spoke with in support that needed to do just this, and I helped them set it up with their paging server, where they needed to make announcements about gas ventilation that was going on in different premises of their facility as they were producing different chemicals, and they wanted a way to automate that, and the paging server gave them that capability. So for next, as we were kind of discussing earlier, the scheduled events and relay activation. So with the scheduled event, you can actually go and trigger the onboard relay. And this is most useful in scenarios where you're not connecting the paging server to an analog amplifier that requires that relay connectivity. Again, if the relay is connected to the amplifier, you can't utilize this functionality. However, if that relay is just sitting there unused, it can be connected into an actual door system. And this was used and actually proposed to us by a school that actually controls all of their doors with an automatic locking system used for emergencies. And what they wanted to do is with every given bell that went off, say when first period starts and then when first period ends, the door would lock and then unlock, locking at the beginning of first period and unlocking at the end of first period. So that way it would easily automate the doors actually going from the locked and unlocked state with the bell system. So it made it really powerful in the event of emergency or just a good way to catch tardy kids. So it's a very, very powerful feature that can be set up through there. So with that one bell going off, it would be set to activate the relay indefinitely, which would then just trigger the relay, and the relay would stay triggered until the deactivate indefinitely command was sent, which is again the end of first period. And that would repeat throughout the through all the different periods of the given day for that high school. So it's a very, very powerful feature to be able to lock and unlock doors with the bell schedule automatically. It's an extremely powerful feature that we added that capability in there, but it's kind of a distinct use case because it's really only relevant for different cases where you would want the paging server to actually facilitate a functionality like that.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.